Everyone said I betrayed my family for money. They believed I walked away from my sick mother without looking back. No one ever asked why I left. They only believed the story my younger sister told them. But 3 days before my mother signed away everything she owned, I uncovered a secret hidden inside our family for nearly 15 years. My name is Brooke Bennett, and for most of my life, I believed being the oldest daughter meant putting everyone else before myself. Whenever Mom needed groceries, I bought them. When the boiler failed in the middle of winter, I paid to replace it before anyone else even offered. Every birthday dinner, every holiday, every unexpected expense somehow landed on my shoulders. My younger sister, Emily, always had a reason she couldn't help. She was too overwhelmed, too busy, or going through a difficult time. Mom defended her every single time. Emily has enough worries already, she'd tell me. You're stronger, Brooke. You always figure things out. After hearing those words for years, I stopped waiting for things to feel fair. I simply kept showing up because I believed that's what family did. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, Mom called and asked me to come over immediately. Her voice sounded strangely nervous. Nothing like the calm woman I had known my entire life. I canceled an important meeting at work without hesitation and drove straight to her house. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Emily's car already parked outside. Through the front window, I could see both of them sitting quietly at the dining table. The moment they noticed my car, their conversation stopped. Emily quickly gathered several papers from the table, folded them neatly, and slipped them into a brown envelope before forcing a smile that looked anything but genuine. I had seen that smile before. It was the smile she wore whenever she was hiding something she didn't want me to discover. I walked toward the front door pretending everything felt normal. But the moment I stepped inside, I realized they had been expecting me for a reason I never could have imagined. The atmosphere inside the house felt strangely cold. Mom stood up as soon as I entered and hugged me, but it wasn't her usual warm embrace. It lasted only a second before she stepped back and glanced toward Emily, almost as if they had rehearsed what was about to happen. "Dea?" Mom asked nervously. I smiled politely. "Only if you're having one." She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Emily and me alone at the dining table. Neither of us spoke. She kept tapping her fingers against the brown envelope while avoiding my eyes. After almost a minute, she finally broke the silence. "Mom's been thinking a lot about the future." I nodded. "That's good." She forced another smile. "You'll understand when she explains everything." Those words should have sounded comforting. Instead, they felt like a warning. A few minutes later, Mom returned carrying 3 mugs of tea. She sat down slowly and pushed one of them toward me before taking a deep breath. "Brooke," she began softly, "I've been speaking with my solicitor." I looked at her confused. "About what?" She hesitated before answering. "About updating my will." The room became completely silent. I wasn't surprised she had a will. I was surprised she had never mentioned changing it before. Mom reached for the brown envelope, opened it carefully, and slid several documents across the table. "Nothing has been signed yet," she said. "I just wanted us to discuss everything together first." I glanced at the papers but didn't pick them up. Instead, I looked at Emily. She wasn't nervous anymore. She looked confident, almost relieved. Then Mom folded her hands together. "The solicitor believes it would be simpler if the house stayed with one person instead of being divided." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" She looked down before quietly answering. "I've decided to leave the house entirely to Emily." I didn't speak. I simply stared at her, waiting for the rest of the explanation. "You have a successful career," Mom continued gently. "You've always managed on your own. Emily needs stability more than you do." I slowly looked toward my sister. She didn't look surprised. She looked prepared. And in that exact moment, I realized this wasn't a family discussion. It was a decision they had already made without me. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. I looked at the papers lying on the table, but made no effort to touch them. It wasn't because I cared about the house. It was because I suddenly realized I was the only person in the room who hadn't known this conversation was coming. Mom slowly reached across the table and rested her hand on mine. "Please don't misunderstand," she said softly. This isn't about loving one daughter more than the other. I gave her a small smile that didn't reach my eyes. Then help me understand what it is about. Before she could answer, Emily leaned forward. Brooke, you've always been independent. You own your flat. You have a great job. You'll be fine. Her words were calm, almost rehearsed. Mom just wants to make sure I always have somewhere to live. I looked at my sister carefully. Since when have you been involved in Mom's meetings with the solicitor? Her expression changed for the briefest moment before she answered. Only recently. It was a simple reply, but something about it felt wrong. Mom quickly interrupted before I could ask another question. Emily has been helping me organize paperwork while you've been busy working. Busy working. The same work that had paid Mom's medical bills the previous winter. The same work that covered her roof repairs when the insurance refused the claim. I reminded myself not to mention any of that. I had never helped my family to keep score. But hearing my sacrifices reduced to simply being busy hurt more than I expected. Mom slowly pushed the documents closer to me. I'd like you to read everything before I sign next week. I finally picked up the first page. It looked like an ordinary draft of a will, until my eyes reached one particular paragraph. Beneath the section about the house was another clause. Emily Bennett will also become sole executor of the estate and assume complete authority over all financial matters. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Every decision, every account, every family asset, everything would belong to Emily. I quietly placed the papers back onto the table. I think I'd like some time to think about this, I said calmly. Neither of them tried to stop me. As I walked toward the front door, I heard Emily quietly whisper something behind me. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard enough to know they believed I'd never question what was really happening. I left Mom's house without saying another word, but Emily's whisper stayed in my mind the entire drive home. She hadn't sounded worried. She had sounded certain. That was the part one couldn't understand. She wasn't acting like someone hoping Mom would choose her. She was acting like someone who already knew the outcome. By the time I reached my flat, I had convinced myself I was overthinking everything. Mom had every right to decide what happened to her own home. It wasn't the will that bothered me anymore. It was the feeling that an important piece of the story had been deliberately kept away from me. That night I made dinner, answered a few work emails, and tried to forget about the conversation. Around 9 o'clock, my phone vibrated. It was a message from my neighbor, Mrs. Harper, who had lived next door to Mom for nearly 20 years. I saw you leave earlier. Everything all right? I smiled politely and replied that everything was fine. Less than a minute later another message appeared. Your sister came back after you left. They looked very happy. I stared at the screen for several seconds before putting the phone face down. Something about those words made my stomach tighten. Why had Emily returned after I left? What was there left to celebrate? The following morning I buried myself in work, hoping the feeling would disappear. Just before lunch, my office receptionist walked over holding a small envelope. This was dropped off for you about 20 minutes ago, she said. There was no stamp, no return address, only my name written across the front in neat handwriting. I thanked her and carefully opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just one typed sentence. If you want the truth about your mother's will, don't ask your sister. Ask the solicitor who prepared the first version. I read the line 3 times before turning the page over. Nothing else. Whoever had sent it knew there had been more than one version of Mom's will. My heart started beating faster. Mom had told me she had only recently decided to update it. But this note suggested the plan had started much earlier. I looked back at the paper one final time before slipping it into my handbag. For the first time since leaving Mom's house, I wasn't wondering whether something was wrong anymore. I was beginning to believe someone inside my own family had been lying to me for a very long time. The anonymous note stayed in my handbag for 2 days before I finally decided to act. I wasn't looking for a fight. I simply wanted answers. Friday afternoon, after finishing work early, I drove to the solicitor's office whose name appeared on Mom's paperwork. I expected the receptionist to tell me they couldn't discuss a client's private affairs, and honestly, That was exactly what happened. I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett, she said politely. Without your mother's permission, we're unable to discuss her estate. I thanked her, turned to leave, and accepted that the mystery might end there. But just as I reached the front door, an older gentleman stepped out of a nearby office. He looked at me for a long moment before quietly saying, Ms. Bennett? I turned around. Yes. He smiled politely. I'm James Carter. I prepared your mother's original estate documents several years ago. My heart skipped a beat. Original. The same word mentioned in the anonymous note. He couldn't discuss confidential details, but before returning to his office, he said something that completely changed my perspective. Your mother has revised her will more than once. He paused for a moment before adding, sometimes people don't change because they want to, sometimes they change because someone convinces them they should. Then he wished me a pleasant afternoon and walked away. That was all. No names. No accusations. Yet somehow those few sentences raised more questions than they answered. More than one version. More than one change. And someone influencing Mom's decisions. As I stepped outside, I realized I wasn't chasing a misunderstanding anymore. I was chasing a pattern. That evening I stopped by Mom's house without calling first. Emily's car wasn't there. Mom answered the door looking surprised but happy to see me. We chatted about ordinary things for nearly 20 minutes before I casually asked, Mom, how many times have you changed your will? The smile disappeared from her face almost instantly. Why would you ask that? She replied quietly. Because someone told me this isn't the first version. She looked away toward the living room before answering. People shouldn't interfere in family matters. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even an explanation. It was an attempt to avoid the question completely. And that single response confirmed something I could no longer ignore. My mother wasn't hiding the truth from me. She was protecting someone else. I left Mom's house that evening with more questions than answers. Her silence had confirmed what my instincts had been telling me from the beginning. Someone wasn't simply advising her. Someone was steering every important decision she made. The following Monday I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. Instead of calling Mom after work like I normally did, I drove past her house. I wasn't spying. I simply wanted to see whether everything she had told me was true. As I turned onto her street, I immediately noticed Emily's car parked in the driveway. That wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the unfamiliar black SUV parked behind it. A middle-aged man in a navy suit was walking toward the front door carrying a leather briefcase. Before he knocked, Mom opened the door as though she had been expecting him. She smiled warmly and invited him inside. I stayed in my car for less than 30 seconds before quietly driving away. I recognized that briefcase. It was almost identical to the one I had seen on the dining table the day Mom first mentioned changing her will. The next afternoon, my phone rang while I was finishing a meeting. The screen showed Mom's name. Hello. I answered cheerfully. Her voice sounded unusually nervous. Brooke, are you busy this evening? I glanced at my calendar. Not after 6. Why? She hesitated before saying, Emily and I are meeting someone about a few documents. I thought, perhaps you didn't need to come. The sentence felt strangely rehearsed. I smiled despite the disappointment. You called just to tell me not to come? There was a long pause. I didn't want you feeling left out, she replied quietly. The irony almost made me laugh. I thanked her, wished her a good evening, and ended the call. For several minutes, I simply stared at my desk. She wasn't trying to include me anymore. She was making sure I stayed away. As I packed my laptop to leave the office, my mobile buzzed again. This time it wasn't Mom. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it before reading the message. You're asking the wrong questions. Don't follow the money. Follow the signatures. Compare every version of the will. I felt a chill run through my body. Whoever was sending these messages clearly knew exactly what was happening behind closed doors. And somehow, they also knew I was getting dangerously close to the truth. The second anonymous message changed everything. Until then, I had been focused on why Mom wanted to leave the house to Emily. Now I realized the house might not be the real story at all. Follow the signatures. Those 3 words repeated in my mind the entire night. Early Tuesday morning, before work, I unlocked the drawer where I kept copies of every important document Mom had ever asked me to organize. For years I had handled her insurance renewals, tax returns, pension forms and bank paperwork. She trusted me with everything. Or at least I thought she had. After almost an hour of searching, I found an old folder labeled estate planning. Inside was a photocopy of Mom's first will from nearly 8 years earlier. I carefully compared it with the draft she had shown me last week. At first glance they looked almost identical. Then I noticed something strange. The signatures were different. Not Mom's signature. The witness signatures. The original document had been witnessed by 2 neighbors I recognized immediately. The new draft listed 2 completely different names. One of them belonged to the man I had seen carrying the leather briefcase into Mom's house. That afternoon I couldn't concentrate on work. Something about the witnesses bothered me. During my lunch break, I searched the name online. Within seconds I found exactly what I wasn't expecting. Michael Reed. Financial consultant. Estate planning advisor. His company specialized in helping elderly clients protect family wealth. I stared at the screen. Mom had never mentioned hiring a financial consultant. She had only spoken about her solicitor. Why would someone outside the family suddenly become involved in changing her estate? Before I could think any further, my phone rang. It was Dad. He rarely called me during the day. "Brooke," he said quietly. "Can you come by tonight? Don't tell your mom." I immediately sat upright. "Is everything all right?" There was a long silence before he answered. "I found something in the garage, and I think you need to see it before anyone else does." His voice wasn't frightened. It sounded disappointed. Deeply disappointed. I told him I'd be there after work. As I ended the call, I looked once more at the consultant's name on my computer screen. Somehow, I knew the papers waiting in Dad's garage were about to connect every lie I'd uncovered into one terrifying truth. I drove to my parents' house that evening with a feeling I couldn't explain. Dad was already waiting in the garage when I arrived. He didn't greet me with his usual smile. Instead, he quietly closed the garage door behind me before pointing toward an old wooden workbench in the corner. Resting on top was a dusty cardboard box sealed with yellowing tape. "I found this while looking for my fishing gear," he said softly. "Your mother asked me years ago never to open it." He paused before looking directly at me. "Today, I did." My stomach tightened. Dad carefully removed the lid and slid the box toward me. Inside were dozens of folders, old bank statements, insurance papers, handwritten notes, and several envelopes marked private. Most of the documents were nearly 10 years old. As I slowly turned the pages, one envelope immediately caught my attention. Across the front, in Mom's handwriting, were 5 simple words. "Original estate documents, do not destroy." Dad folded his arms and watched silently as I opened the envelope. Inside was Mom's very first will. My hands began shaking as I read through it. Everything had been divided equally. The house, her savings, even the family jewelry. Every asset was to be shared 50-50 between Emily and me. There was nothing unusual about it until I reached the final page. Attached to the will was another letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was written entirely in Mom's handwriting. "If anything ever changes in this document, it will not be because Brooke has failed me. She has carried this family more than anyone will ever know." I stopped reading. Dad quietly looked away. "I never knew she wrote that," he admitted. "Neither did I." Then something slipped from the back of the envelope and landed on the floor. It was a folded receipt dated only 6 months earlier. I picked it up slowly. Across the top was the logo of Reed Financial Advisory. Beneath it was a single payment listed as estate restructuring consultation. Paid in full. The signature at the bottom wasn't Mom's. It belonged to Emily. My heart sank. Emily hadn't simply attended the meetings. She had hired the consultant herself. I slowly looked at Dad. He stared at the receipt for several long seconds before whispering, "Your mother always believed she was making these decisions herself." Neither of us spoke again, because we both understood exactly what that receipt meant. Someone hadn't just influenced Mom's will. They had been planning every change long before she ever signed a single page. Neither Dad nor I spoke for several minutes. The garage suddenly felt smaller, as though the truth packed inside that cardboard box had taken all the air with it. I carefully placed the receipt back into the envelope and looked toward him. Does Mom know Emily paid for those meetings? He slowly shook his head. I don't think so. His answer came without hesitation. Your mother believed the consultant was simply helping her organize paperwork. Emily told her it was part of a free family planning service. I closed my eyes for a second. A free service. Somehow, that sounded exactly like something Emily would say. She had always known how to present an idea in a way that made Mom feel safe. Dad reached into the box again and removed another folder. There's something else. Inside were several handwritten notes from different meetings. Most of them listed ordinary things, bank accounts, pension details, insurance policies, but one page had been folded separately from the rest. Across the top someone had written future planning discussion. As I read through it, one sentence made my heart stop. Brooke is financially secure. She is unlikely to contest future decisions if presented as acts of compassion toward Emily. I stared at the words in complete disbelief. They were predicting how I'd react. Dad nodded sadly. They weren't asking what was fair. They were planning how to convince you to accept it. My hands tightened around the paper. This wasn't a family conversation anymore. It was a strategy. Every meeting, every explanation, every emotional speech Mom had given me, someone had carefully built them long before I ever walked into that dining room. Just then my phone vibrated. It was Emily. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. Instead, I answered. Hi Brooke, she said cheerfully, sounding happier than she had in weeks. Mom wants everyone to come over Sunday afternoon. I kept my voice calm. What's happening Sunday? Oh, she laughed lightly. I forgot to tell you. We're having one final meeting before Mom signs the will. I looked at Dad. He slowly lowered his eyes. Emily continued speaking. It'll be nice if we're all together. I smiled politely. I'll be there. She thanked me and ended the call. The garage fell silent once again. Dad looked at me carefully. What are you going to do? I folded every document back into the envelope before answering. I'm not going there to argue. I looked down at the consultant's receipt one last time. I'm going there to find out who this plan was really meant to protect. Sunday arrived far sooner than I wanted. I barely slept the night before, replaying every document I'd found in Dad's garage. By noon I had organized copies of the original will, the consultant's receipt, and the meeting notes into a single folder. I wasn't planning to accuse anyone. I simply refused to walk into another family meeting without knowing the truth. When I pulled into Mom's driveway, 3 cars were already parked outside. Emily's, Dad's, and the black SUV belonging to Michael Reed. He was already inside. Through the front window I saw him arranging folders neatly across the dining table, while Emily stood beside him, smiling confidently. It looked less like a family discussion, and more like a business meeting that had been planned weeks in advance. As soon as I stepped inside, Michael greeted me with a professional handshake. Ms. Bennett, he said politely. It's nice to finally meet you. Finally. The word immediately caught my attention. If he had been advising Mom for months, why had nobody introduced us before today? I smiled politely but didn't answer. Mom invited everyone to sit down while Michael opened his leather briefcase. Today's meeting is simply to confirm Mrs. Bennett's final wishes before the documents are signed, he explained calmly. Once everyone has had an opportunity to ask questions, we'll proceed with the paperwork. Everything sounded perfectly reasonable. Too reasonable. I quietly watched Emily. She wasn't looking at Mom. She wasn't even looking at the documents. She kept watching Michael instead, almost as though she was waiting for him to follow a script they both already knew. The meeting continued for almost 20 minutes. Michael carefully explained inheritance laws while Mom nodded along, trusting every word he said. Then he placed the final version of the will in front of her and handed her a pen. Whenever you're ready, he smiled. Mom reached for the pen. But before the tip touched the paper, I quietly spoke. Before Mom signs anything. Every head turned toward me. I'd like to ask Mr. Reed one very simple question. He smiled politely. Of course. I slowly opened my folder and removed the consultation receipt Dad and I had found in the garage. Then I placed it directly in front of him. His smile disappeared instantly, because the receipt revealed one fact nobody else in the room had ever been meant to discover. Emily, not my mother, had hired him from the very beginning. The room fell completely silent. Michael looked down at the receipt for only a second before carefully sliding it back across the table. "Where did you find this?" he asked calmly. I didn't answer his question. Instead, I asked my own. Why was my sister paying an estate consultant before Mom had even decided to change her will? His confident expression faded slightly. Emily immediately leaned forward. "Brooke, you're twisting everything." I turned toward her. "Am I?" Then I looked back at Michael. "If Mom hired you, why is Emily's signature on every payment?" Mom frowned in confusion and slowly reached for the receipt herself. She studied it carefully before looking at Emily. "You told me the consultations were arranged through the solicitor." Emily's face immediately lost its color. "Mom, I was only trying to help." It wasn't an answer. It was an escape. Michael quietly cleared his throat before speaking again. "Mrs. Bennett, perhaps we should continue this discussion privately." Before he could gather his papers, Dad placed one hand firmly on the folder. "No," he said calmly. "Everything stays exactly where it is." It was the first time all afternoon he had interrupted anyone. Michael slowly removed his hand from the documents. I reached into my folder once more and placed another sheet onto the table. This time it wasn't the receipt. It was the handwritten meeting note Dad and I had discovered in the garage. I gently turned it so everyone could read the sentence highlighted across the middle. "Brooke is financially secure. She is unlikely to contest future decisions if presented as acts of compassion toward Emily." Mom's eyes moved across the page before stopping completely. She looked at Michael, then at Emily, then back at the note. "Who wrote this?" she whispered. Nobody answered. "Who wrote this?" she repeated louder this time. Emily finally stood up from her chair. "It wasn't supposed to sound like that," she said nervously. "We were only discussing possibilities." Mom looked at her in complete disbelief. "Possibilities?" Her voice trembled. "You were planning how to convince your own sister to give up everything before I had even made a decision." Tears slowly filled Mom's eyes. She looked towards Michael. "Did you write this?" He hesitated for the first time since arriving. That hesitation told us everything. Before anyone could speak again, Mom quietly closed the will, pushed it away from herself and stood up. "Nobody is signing anything today." She looked directly at Emily, her voice steadier than before. "Because before I decide who deserves this house." She paused, struggling to hold back tears. "I need to know how many other lies I've been living with." Nobody moved. Mom remained standing beside the dining table, her hands resting on the unopened will as tears quietly rolled down her face. Emily looked as though she wanted to explain herself, but every excuse seemed to disappear before it reached her lips. Michael slowly gathered his briefcase. "Mrs. Bennett," he said carefully, "perhaps this isn't the best time to continue." Mom turned toward him with an expression I had never seen before. "No," she replied firmly. "This is exactly the right time." She pointed toward the chair across from her. "Sit down." Even Michael hesitated before quietly sitting again. For the first time since entering the house, he looked like a man who had lost control of the meeting. Mom picked up the handwritten note once more and looked directly at Emily. "Tell me the truth." Emily lowered her head. "I was scared," she whispered. "Scared of what?" Mom asked. "Of losing everything." Her voice cracked as she continued. "When I found out Brooke had already bought her own flat, I convinced myself she'd never need this house. Then Mr. Reed said it would make more sense if everything stayed with one person." She glanced toward Michael before quickly looking away. "He told me families avoid arguments when one child is financially stronger." Dad shook his head in disbelief. "No," he said quietly. "He told you what you wanted to hear." The room fell silent again. Emily covered her face with both hands. "I never wanted Brooke to know about the meetings," she admitted. "I thought, if she believed it was Mom's idea, she'd accept it." Those words hurt more than I expected. Not because of the house. Because my own sister had spent months planning how to make me believe my mother no longer valued me. Mom slowly walked around the table, until she was standing beside me. She placed one trembling hand on my shoulder before looking at Emily. Your sister has carried this family for years, she said quietly. And instead of thanking her, you tried to use her kindness against her. Emily began crying uncontrollably, but Mom didn't stop. She picked up the final version of the will, tore it cleanly in half, then tore it again. The sound of the paper ripping echoed through the silent dining room. She dropped the pieces onto the table and looked toward Michael. Your services are no longer required. He quietly packed his briefcase without saying another word. As he reached the front door, he turned back one final time. And the sentence he spoke before leaving changed everything I thought the story was about. Mrs. Bennett. He said quietly. This wasn't Emily's idea in the beginning. Michael's words froze everyone in the room. This wasn't Emily's idea in the beginning. Emily slowly lifted her tear-filled eyes. What are you talking about? Mom whispered. Michael sighed heavily before placing his briefcase back on the floor. For the first time since arriving, he wasn't speaking like a confident consultant. He sounded like a man who knew he could no longer hide behind professionalism. I was hired 18 months ago, he admitted quietly. By who? Nobody answered. Dad stared at him. Emily looked completely confused. Mom's hands trembled. Finally, Michael looked directly at Dad. It wasn't your daughter. It wasn't your wife. It was. He stopped for a second. Your brother. The room went completely silent. Uncle Peter? Dad asked, unable to believe what he had heard. Michael nodded. He contacted our firm first. My heart started racing. Uncle Peter lived nearly 3 hours away. He rarely visited. He had absolutely nothing to do with our family finances. So why? I asked quietly. Michael reached into his briefcase and removed another file. I believe you deserve to know. He placed it carefully on the table. Dad opened it first. His face immediately lost every trace of color. Inside were property maps, old mortgage records, land valuations, and one document highlighted in yellow. Dad whispered only 4 words. I can't believe this. I leaned closer. The document showed that the land beneath Mom's house had recently been approved for a major commercial redevelopment project. Its value had increased almost overnight. Instead of being worth a few £100,000, the property was now worth several million. Nobody spoke. Michael finally broke the silence. Mr. Peter Bennett learned about the redevelopment nearly 2 years ago. He believed whoever inherited this property would become extremely wealthy. Emily looked horrified. He told me none of that, she whispered. Michael nodded slowly. I know. He simply instructed me to encourage your mother to leave the entire estate to one beneficiary. Dad slammed the file shut. So Peter manipulated this entire family. Over land? Michael looked down. I believe he expected Emily to inherit everything. And later, sell the property to a company connected to him. Mom slowly collapsed into her chair. The tears she'd been holding back finally escaped. My own brother. Planned this. Nobody answered, because every person sitting around that table had just realized something terrifying. This had never been a fight between 2 sisters. It had been a carefully planned scheme that started long before either of them knew they were part of it. For several minutes, nobody said a single word. Mom sat motionless, staring at the property documents as though they belonged to another family. Dad slowly removed his glasses and covered his face with one hand. Emily looked completely shattered. The confidence she had carried for months had vanished. I didn't know about the land, she whispered. I swear I didn't. I believed her. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I could see she had been manipulated too. She had made terrible choices, but she hadn't created the plan. Someone else had. Dad finally stood up and walked to the window. Peter has always wanted this property, he said quietly. When our parents passed away, he tried to convince me to sell it. He said the neighborhood would never be worth anything. He laughed bitterly. Now I know why. He turned back toward Mom. He wasn't protecting us. He was waiting. Mum slowly looked up, her eyes filled with regret. And while I was listening to everyone else, she whispered, I stopped listening to my own daughters. The sentence hit every one of us harder than any argument could have. Just then, the front doorbell rang. Nobody had invited anyone else. Dad opened the door. Standing outside was Uncle Peter. He smiled as though nothing had happened. I thought the meeting would be finished by now, he said casually before noticing the silence inside the house. His eyes immediately landed on the property file sitting open on the dining table. His smile disappeared. What's going on? He asked carefully. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he walked over, picked up the highlighted valuation report, and held it in front of him. You knew. Peter tried to laugh. Knew what? You knew this land was worth millions. Another silence. Then Peter slowly realized there was no point pretending anymore. I was trying to protect the family, he replied calmly. Dad shook his head. No. You were trying to protect yourself. Peter's expression hardened. If Emily inherited everything, the property could have been sold without complications. Mum stared at her brother in complete disbelief. You planned all this? Using my own family? Peter didn't deny it. He simply shrugged. It was business. Those two words changed everything. Dad walked to the dining table, picked up the original will that Brooke had found in the old storage box, and placed it directly in front of Mum. Then he looked into her eyes and quietly said, the only person who never treated this family like a business was Brooke. At that moment, Mum burst into tears, because she finally understood the truth. She hadn't nearly lost her home. She had nearly lost the one daughter who had loved her without asking for anything in return. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. There were no more secret meetings. No more whispered conversations behind closed doors. Uncle Peter disappeared the same afternoon Dad asked him to leave the house, and none of us heard from him again. A week later, Mum called another family meeting. This time there were no consultants, no legal advisors, and no hidden folders. Just the four of us sitting around the same dining table, where everything had begun. Mum placed a new document in front of me before taking a deep breath. This is my final will, she said softly. No one has seen it except my solicitor. She smiled through her tears. And this time, every decision inside it is mine. I looked at the first page, but stopped before reading any further. Mum, I said gently, I don't need to know what's in it. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I know. Her voice trembled. But I need you to know that I finally made my decisions without fear. And without anyone speaking for me. Emily slowly stood up from her chair and walked over to me. She looked exhausted, as though the guilt she'd been carrying had finally become too heavy to hide. Brooke, she whispered, I spent months believing I deserved something simply because I wanted it more. I never stopped to think about who had quietly sacrificed everything so I could keep chasing my own life. Tears rolled down her face. I'm so sorry. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I stood up and hugged her. Not because everything had been forgotten, but because forgiveness begins when someone finally accepts the truth without making excuses. Dad smiled quietly from the other side of the table. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen on his face in months. 3 months later, the redevelopment company officially offered to purchase the land. Mum refused. Instead, she renovated the old house, paid off every remaining debt, and created a small education fund that one day would belong equally to her future grandchildren. Some things are worth more than money, she said the day the paperwork was completed. She was right. As I stood beside my family in the freshly restored garden, I realized the greatest inheritance Mum could ever leave behind wasn't the house. It was the lesson we had all learned too late. Wealth can divide a family overnight, but honesty has the power to rebuild what greed almost destroys. I looked around at the people standing beside me and smiled. For the first time in years, nobody was pretending. Nobody was hiding. Nobody was choosing money over family. Because in the end, the greatest thing my mother ever gave us wasn't her estate. It was the courage to choose the truth before it was too late. Sometimes the biggest betrayal isn't losing money. It's discovering that the people you trusted were willing to trade your love for their own advantage. But this story also reminds us of something even more important. The truth may be delayed, but it has a way of finding the light. Real family isn't measured by inheritance, property, or wealth. It's measured by honesty, loyalty, and the people who choose you even when there's nothing to gain. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more original emotional family stories every week. And let me know in the comments. What would you have done if you were Brooke? Would you have forgiven your family? Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care of yourself, and always remember, never let money decide your worth. Because the people who truly love you never will.